Hello, all, and thank you so much for tuning in to COVID Conversations by way of Zoom on WNCU 90.7 FM. We're using this platform to talk about how the virus is affecting the way that we live today. And I have the very good pleasure of having as my guest Dr. Henry McKoy Jr. Now, he's a professor and director of entrepreneurship at the School of Business at North Carolina Central University. Hello, and how are you?
Oh, good afternoon.
Good, it's nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. It's nice to be seen. It's always good to have, some interaction and communication during these times. I'm glad to be here.
Yep, and as an economist, I can imagine that you're very busy too. So tell me what it is that you do as an economist.
So, in normal times, I spend a decent amount of my time really thinking about some of the economic challenges that we have as a country, as a state, as a local community. Particularly, my focus is on what I call economic ecosystems, really understanding how different populations, specifically across race and gender, how their economic outcomes are different. So, the economic conditions of African Americans, of Latinos, other minorities compared to white counterparts. And so my research is focused specifically around how do we come up with solutions, whether it be policy or action oriented, that can go about addressing those inequalities and inequities and essentially, creating wealth and opportunity across communities. Now, in this kind of current pandemic and COVID world, I spend a lot of my time talking about, the disparate impacts that COVID has had on different communities and what might be some possible ways to address those things and really, just what the likely long-term impact will be from the COVID environment and what, we can do to think about those things.
Okay, I'm going to read you a statement. In my research, I found this. Economics is not epidemiology, but the coronavirus pandemic brings steep economic challenges affecting consumption, production, investment, and employment. And economic policy will at large extend, shape society's resilience to the emergency and what lies beyond. What's your thought on that statement?
Well, it's a long but very accurate statement. And what I mean by that is one of the interesting things, or one of the unique things about what we're going through right now with the COVID crisis is that we're dealing with simultaneous crises at one time. We're dealing with both a health crisis and an economic crisis. But the economic crisis is driven specifically by the health crises. And so why that's unique and different is that usually when we have economic crises, they're driven by some economic force. So in the 2008 recession, we dealt with the whole, mortgage crisis that was going on, the financial crisis that was going on globally. During the Great Depression back in the 30s, that was a crisis in terms of stocks and things of that nature. This really is an economic crisis that is driven by a health crisis. And until the health crisis is addressed, the economic crisis will not be. So in more layman's terms, until we get a cure, some kind of vaccine or something for the COVID-19 issue, then we're going to have a very hard time addressing fully the reopening of the overall economy, which is certainly something that we've spent a lot of time listening to and hearing about in recent times.
So can you tell me, what are some of the economic challenges for the state and the country as the pandemic?
Well, I think certainly the biggest driver of the economic crisis is the fact that because the contagion of the virus is so strong and so potent that you really have a hard time putting people in the same space, in the same room. So when you talk about restaurants and where people can sit, when you talk about office spaces and where people can go and do work, when you talk about tourism and airport travel and all those kind of things, all these things have, real impacts on the overall economy. And so, at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, what all of these different levels of governments are dealing with is really some level of figuring out, well, how do we keep people working? How do we keep income flowing? How do we keep the dollar moving from business to business whenever people have to sit in their homes and can't go out and shop? And so at each of those different levels, it's a enormous challenge.
So what about then consumption? How has consumption been affected?
Well, consumption is nothing more than, how we decide to go and spend our money, right? So on some levels, some aspects of consumption have not been impacted in the sense of people have not stopped consuming them. So for example, people still have to pay mortgages and they still have to pay rent. They still have to pay light bills. They have to pay their car notes, things of that nature. So from that standpoint, those aspects of consumptions at that kind of macro level haven't changed. But on a day-to-day real standpoint, they do change. So, for example, we know people aren't driving a lot of places now. I put a tank of gas in my car probably 2 months ago, and I haven't driven that out at all. In terms of restaurants, people go out and eat on a regular basis, or they go to the movies, or they go shopping, and all those things from a consumption standpoint have come to a standstill for the most part. And so that's really how the economy operates, how it grows, is that people on a day-to-day basis, they get paid, they take money, they have some level of disposable income, and they go out and they shop, they buy things. Sometimes they buy things they need, sometimes they buy things they won't, but that's essentially consumption. And so because of the health pandemic, consumption has really shrank dramatically because we have shut down the overall economy. So that's really why consumption has had this huge impact on unemployment. And so to take that a step further from an economic standpoint, recessions are driven because people get laid off from their jobs, so they're unemployed. Those people decide, well, I'm unemployed, so I can't spend the same kind of money that I've spent before. So they stop spending money, which then means that stores and folks that sell the goods and services have less revenue, which means they then have to lay off people because they can't afford to keep those people. Those new people that enter into the cycle go through that same process of saying, well, I can't afford to buy things. And so that's why recessions can often be these kind of vicious cycles where consumption shrinks so much that people keep losing jobs.
Okay, and then I guess that would segue into production. So how's production affected?
Yeah, same way. I mean, if nobody's buying, then you have an issue with producing things, right? And so I think production in this pandemic has been twofold. So on one level, you have production as relates to the sense that people still would want to consume the product or service, but they just really have no need. So going back to my example about gasoline, so gasoline is now at some of the lowest prices we've seen in years. Part of that was driven by this kind of price war that was happening before, or we entered into the crisis, and some of that is because people are just not using gas. And so from that production standpoint, Saudi Arabia, whoever's producing the gas or the oil that turns into gas, they just have less demand for that product or service, and therefore production slows because they can't sell what they already produce, and that creates its own process and problem with unemployment. On the other side, what we know from the health crisis, when you think about, say, our food production cycle, similar to the gas analogy, when folks aren't able to go out to eat in restaurants, and then that impacts farmers and what they're producing. We saw those stories about farmers who having to throw away food and get rid of milk and things of that nature because they just don't have the customer on the other end. And so it does have a huge impact on production from that standpoint. Then I say the final piece of that is that if you think about these manufacturers of food and chicken and things like that who have experienced these issues of outbreaks with their employees, that certainly has an impact on production, right? If your employees are sick and they can't be in the factory producing, then they're going to have a hard time, producing enough to get out to the marketplace. So you go to some grocery stores and you see this, they have a limit on what you can buy. You can only buy 1 pack of meat or 2 packs of meat and things of that nature. And we also see that the price has gone up dramatically. And that's a function of lack of lower production as well.
What about Black and brown businesses? How vulnerable are they during this pandemic?
Well, they're incredibly vulnerable. When you talk about, minorities, Black and brown businesses, entrepreneurs. So, the old economic saying that when whites get a cold, Blacks get pneumonia. Or think about this: what happens when whites get COVID-19? It just exacerbates the challenges that we already seen. And so the reality of it is that the issues that we're seeing in the community are issues that have been here a long time. And so the COVID-19 didn't create inequality and inequity. It didn't create some of the challenges that these businesses have with access to capital. It didn't create those things, but it certainly has accentuated what we know to be the problem. And it's also accelerated some of these gaps that we've seen. And so for many Black and brown businesses, you're dealing with a number of things. They're dealing with the same issues as the broader businesses who are seeing a lack of demand because the businesses are shut down. People can't go and shop or buy. They're dealing with that. So they're dealing with that loss of revenue. On top of that, whenever the government comes out with a response like the PPP program that helps to maintain payrolls and things of that nature, the government put those things directly into institutions that have historically discriminated against these businesses anyway. And so if you put the resources through the same vehicle that has not served these populations before, you're gonna have the same outcome. And so it becomes a crisis within a crisis that you have. You have these businesses that have struggled in even the best of times, and now in the worst of times, they really are being impacted dramatically, and the response that the government has put out is not addressing those needs directly.
So I was watching television this morning, and the reporters were saying that the White House is set to vote on changes to the small business program today. What went wrong the first time, and then how, in your opinion, can it be corrected?
So I think, one of the things that went wrong, and we all saw these stories as well, some of the largest corporations, public corporations, getting access to capital through these programs that came out through Congress. And part of the challenge is that, certainly everybody has been hit hard by this. You shut down the economy, which means that airlines, restaurants, other organizations like that just aren't going to get the customers that they used to have. However, a lot of these major corporations had huge balance sheets. You heard about the airlines saying that this was the most profitable business season they had before COVID came. You have public companies who have the ability to get access to capital from the public markets. They can borrow. They can raise capital in a number of different ways, selling stock. Well, those are the companies that were the first in line to run out to get access to some of these programs. And so I say the first challenge and issue with the way the program was rolled out was just this idea of who actually needs help. The second part goes back to what I said earlier, is about, well, what is the vehicle for getting that money into the communities that need it? And by putting it through the largest and most major banks, what you ended up doing was creating a barrier to getting that access to capital for the businesses that needed it the most. The banks had, in reality, some level of self-interest to serve their customers first, because those are the ones that they don't want to see those customers default. And so it created really a challenge and an issue with those individuals who didn't have banking relationships with those folks to get access to resources. And so I say, to answer your question, one of the biggest challenges that and kind of issues that came out with the first round was that it really didn't take into account the context of who actually needed the resources in a real way. You can't have a one-size-fit-all for the community. Communities are impacted differently, and they have different access to different vehicles for capital. And so I think that the government can do a much better job of really targeting capital. And at the end of the day, capital matters. And if you want to make sure that Black and brown businesses survive, you got to have a very direct way to get money into the hands of those entrepreneurs and those business leaders.
Okay, one last question. North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper is in a very delicate situation. Should the state be fully open? Should phase 2 go slower? Should there be a slowdown? In your opinion, how do politics, business, and people come together to make this negative outcome less during the pandemic?
Well, certainly a interesting mix, as you mentioned, when you're dealing with politics and business and people and how that all plays out. You know, we seeing here in North Carolina specifically, just these opposing sides. When you do polls and surveys of the average person across the state, and North Carolina has about 10 million people, a little over 10 million people, you see overwhelmingly people say we feel like that the state should be slower to open up, that we got to take health in consideration. So polls overwhelmingly show that the majority of people actually believe that the governor has had the really the right to have businesses open up slower and reopen. On the other side of that, we have what we know to be essentially a minority of individuals who are pushing the governor to reopen, reopen North Carolina and things of that nature. When we see it on television, we see the crowds. It looks like a ton of people. We just had over the Memorial Day weekend, there were a number of different protests around the state, in Asheville and Greensville and Raleigh and things of that nature. But it's still really the minority of folks. But it is politics at the end of the day. We know at the federal level, presidents who have a hard time having good economies, who don't have good economies, have a hard time getting reelected. And certainly that has driven, I believe, the desire of the White House to get the economy back up and running. But we got to think about this in the real sense. There is a health crisis going on. And, as they say, if folks are dying and things of that nature, you're not going to have an economy anyway. We also know that the reality of it is just because you open something up doesn't mean that you're going to get the same kind of traffic going there to purchase your good or services, because there are a lot of folks who are still very weary about the idea of going back into the economy. But it is a dynamic mix. And I say, as a governor, like any other politician, they're having to weigh all these different voices in their ears and figure out, well, what does my conscience tell me to do versus what do, some level of individual tell me they want to do. We know that there's all these lawsuits that are coming about. Gym owners are now suing the governor to reopen their gyms, and some say that they're going to open regardless of what comes out of the lawsuit. Churches, sued to get open. But part of the challenge of that is that we are headed down a slippery slope. If you want a country that has so-called law and order, then at some level you have to follow the law and order. And it can't be a wild, wild west where everybody decides that for my own individual sake, I'm going to not think about my fellow citizen or my fellow resident in the community, because what I want for me is the only thing that matters. That's a recipe for disaster in both the short term and long term. And one of the questions going to be is, in the post-COVID world, what is law and order going to look like when you have a situation where folks have pushed back against rules and regulations because they say, well, hey, that's unconstitutional because you're stumping on my rights. How do you enforce that in the long run if you set precedents during these times that goes against that?
Okay, time is winding down. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to share?
No, I think you had some very thoughtful and wonderful questions, and I appreciate it. I think that hopefully the viewers and listeners of this will understand that, again, what it comes down to is that I think there's certainly things that we can do to adapt to a world that we are in, that are tied, that we have this health pandemic. So certainly you can't keep an economy closed fully forever. We have to figure out a way to go back and get it moving. But at the same time, we risked, if we try to open too soon, that basically we're just going to end up back in this place again, where we try to open up too soon, things move forward, and then we have an enormous spike in new cases, and you just have to go back to closing down again. And so how we respond to this and the thoughtfulness is going to be very important to the long-term health of both us as citizens and residents, as well as the overall health of the economy.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Henry McKoy, Jr. And I want to make sure I get your title correct. You are Professor and Director of Entrepreneurship at the School of Business at North Carolina Central University. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for your time.